Okay, cool. So, yeah, welcome to Lecture 7. Here, what I want to try and do is talk through. Initially, it was going to be 4, but I decided to give you a super secret extra bonus thing, and I'm going to talk about 5 different ways that assertions can go wrong. And we'll try and detail what we mean by go wrong and pull these different kinds of ways apart. But before doing that, a very quick pragmatic interlude. And pragmatic not in the sense that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but just about the kind of structure of the course, particularly about assessment. So we talked about this last week, right? Just first about the written assignments. So they're due, I believe, the week, like the Friday after the last lecture. So they're due in let's call it 4 weeks. Yeah, exactly, right? Really what I'm interested in here, this is just an opportunity for you to critically engage with one of the arguments that we've looked at or that was in the reading that maybe we didn't talk about. I'm not really looking for you to just rehash something we've done in the slides, though it's not the end of the world if you do that too. It's really just an opportunity. I'm 100% certain that as we've been going through this stuff, there will be something that we will have run across that you're like, I don't agree with that, or I think this doesn't work for this reason. It's an opportunity to do that. Now, it's fine if it ends up that all you're going to do is just like, hey, right, I think the kind of critique that was offered in the lecture or in discussion is suitable. But if we do that kind of thing, try and say a little bit more. Don't just say what we've done. But the real aim here isn't to, put a lot of pressure on you or anything like that. It's meant to be an opportunity, right? Yes?
There's one question I have. Since there are now multiple topics that have been scrapped from actually being talked about in class, can those still be discussed?
Absolutely. And I'm very happy to upload some reading on the topics that we didn't do. I'm going to try and take care of that in the next couple weeks as well, because I think they're worth kind of looking into. So, in particular, really what I'm hoping you do is, as I put at the bottom, explicate, evaluate, and assess effectiveness. So explicate, basically tell me what the argument that you're looking at is, try and make it as clear as possible, and ideally try and situate it in some kind of broader debate. Like, what is the point of this argument, both in terms of what is it going towards, but why should we be interested in this? Okay, so Davidson arguing, we talked about this last week, saying that metaphors, all they have in terms of their content is the literal semantic content of what their words say, right? Why does he want to do this? Because very broadly, he wants to kind of adopt what we called last week a reductionist account. So there you go. That's a kind of situating this. It doesn't have to be massive, right? Just a couple sentences to say. The thing I'm really interested in is, again, give me an argument in response, raise some objections, or say why this premise is false, or maybe the argument was already bad and how you would fix it. These kinds of things, right? And then finally, just at the end, kind of tying it back to that situatedness, say what the upshot is, not just for the local argument you're talking about, or the debate the argument you're looking at is in. So again, running with the Davidson example, if you show that there are reasons to think metaphors have more content than just their literal content, then an easy explanation would be, cool, so this broad reductionist move can't be right. We're going to have to adopt one of the other 2 options. That's enough. Make sense? Questions on these? So that's what I really wanted to say with regards to the written assignments. They're not meant to be massive. It's really just an opportunity. Was there something that you wanted to talk about that we didn't? Something that maybe we did talk about and you want to say some more about? That's the option. Right? Now, that's the first kind of assessment. The second kind of assessment is the exam. And I know the date of the exam, we don't have the time yet, So the exam is on the 17th. And I wanted to talk to you about the format. So as it stands, I've got two ideas about the format, and I want to see if there are strong opinions for one or the other. So broadly, the way I'm thinking about this is that if each written assignment is worth, I like thinking about these in terms of points rather than grade that you get. Right? So each written assignment's worth 10 points. We got to get out of 100. Since there's 2 written assignments, that means there's 80 points going for this exam. Now I see that naturally dividing up as either 8 10-point questions or 4 20-pointers. The idea would be, right, I could either give you just 8 questions, basically one from each lecture, effectively. And then these would be targeted at some particular point from the lecture. And then what you need to do is kind of, okay, articulate the points and then make your own conclusion. Or slightly broader ones, where it would tie together, say, potentially multiple lectures. For example, how should we think about the semantics for proper names? Cool. There's one. And in this case, you could draw in from the lectures 1 and 2. How would we understand implicatures? Drawing on Grice stuff and the speech act stuff that we've talked about. These kinds of things. Now, notably, these ones require much longer answers. That's good and bad. Right? It's good in the sense that you get more of a chance to kind of build your own argument. It's bad in the sense that, well, it might need to draw in a bunch more material all in one go. I'm happy with either. Are there kind of, strong opinions either way amongst you guys?
It seems like the more targeted questions are easier to process. You just have more quantity of them. And the other one are a bit harder because it requires a higher level of cognition. You need like oversight, but you have less questions.
That is exactly my thinking on it. Yeah. So, I mean, thoughts, hopes, dreams here? If no strong opinions, that's okay. Yeah.
Is it a slower exam?
Yes. I know I picked some word ranges. I mean, these are probably more substantive than what you'd actually have, right? I don't expect you to write 4,000 words in 2 hours. But this is kind of giving you an idea of like, right, that's going to be some maybe paragraph or 2. This is going to be, let's call it 4 to 5 paragraphs, right? As an example.
My favorite first one.
That's fair?
Yeah, me too.
Is that good? That's totally fine. Cool. So then what I will do, I will write up these sample, but the nice thing is I've already basically got the sample questions for that done. So I'll put up the sample questions for this format, and that's the kind of structure of the exam that we'll do. We'll have targeted questions. Effectively, there's going to be one from each lecture. So what I'll try to do, obviously, as the kind of sample questions, the prep sheet, I'm going to give you 2 questions from each lecture. You know that these questions are going to appear one way or the other. So if they're not on the first one, they're probably on the reset. Questions on the format then? Is it clear? So I'll make an announcement about this, and again, upload these sort of study questions as we get closer.
I haven't read the syllabus, but I saw that we have 2 assignments due to 2 of those. That's accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So obviously 2 different arguments here, right?
Yeah.
One on one, one on the other. Cool. Practicality is reasonably clear. Nice. Okay. So on to sweet content. Here's the 5 things I want to do. I want to start by actually doing something that we implicitly did last week, but make it explicit. So that is try to unify all of the stuff we've thought about so far to get a kind of coherent picture of what's going on with a bunch of these kinds of utterances we'll talk about. So tying together the semantics, the pragmatics, the idea of doing speech acts to kind of get us a way to make sense of things. Because this came up when we were talking about metaphors and the kind of blur between locating the metaphorical content. I thought we could articulate that. And then once we have this kind of unified picture, it will also subsequently help us draw 5 different ways of getting assertions wrong. So we'll talk about nonsense in a very technical sense of nonsense. Then we'll pull apart error and lying. And this will set us up to talk about Frankfurt's notion of bullshit, which importantly, Frankfurt thinks is distinct from these 3 categories. So he thinks it's not error, it's not lying. Lying's the big one he really wants to distinguish it from, and it's not nonsense. It's something distinct and different. So we'll get through those 4, and then we'll end by talking about fiction and how we can kind of see fiction as, again, in some sense, getting assertions wrong. So that's the plan. I want to try and go through all of these today. So let's start by unifying the picture, right? So this is really the broad idea of trying to draw together the threads that we talked about in the first 5 lectures. So we won't talk about metaphors, but it will try and fit everything else that we've done together. So first, some terminology, just to help us. And this is something that's been implicit, but it's, again, useful to make explicit. Let's draw a distinction between sentences and utterances. So sentences are linguistic expressions. They're a string either of literal, like, symbols or sounds, right, that satisfy grammatical rules of a language. So a sentence, right, is literally just a bit of language that satisfies the sentence construction rules for that language. In contrast, an utterance is, sorry, was that a question?
No, I was questioning
sorry.
there.
I just saw it out of the corner of my eye. That's fine. An utterance, in contrast, is going to be use of a particular piece of language by a speaker, right, in a context. So effectively, as I'm standing here, I'm making a bunch of utterances. Part of these utterances are the sentences I'm using. And the idea here we can kind of draw apart, right? There's the string that is, my shirt is black, versus the utterance that is me saying that. Expressing that sentence in a context to an audience with some intention behind it. Now, it's worth noting that what we're going to talk about for the remainder is going to be utterances. And the reason it's going to be utterances is we want to include things like implicatures, and we want to include stuff like speech acts. And sentences on their own aren't going to do that. Because sentences aren't expressed, they're not in context, they're just literal bits of language. It's only once they are used that they do any of this stuff. There's an interesting question of whether sentences inherently have meaning, whether sentences inherently have semantic content, or whether that only comes about when they're uttered. Note, for what we're going to do, we can leave that and just be neutral about that question.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, that was my question, but yeah.
So there's a challenge here. If we think, going way back to the very beginning, that things like proper names or predicates or verbs have their meaning, their semantic content kind of just naturally as part of expressing themselves, sure, then we can talk about the meaning of the sentences. But for our purposes, we can just focus on the utterance. How is this string being used in a context?
Yeah.
Is an utterance always spoken language?
No. So importantly, right, it's just a use. So it could be written, it could be verbal.
The context is important, and in a sentence, it's considered on its own.
Exactly. Exactly. You can basically think about this sentence as, in certain construals, almost like an abstract object.
Yeah.
Right? That's being tokened by us uttering it, by us expressing it, either writing it down or saying it. Right? Again, it's by a particular speaker to a particular audience in a particular context versus just the string itself. We're going to focus on utterances. Now, when we think about utterances, there's several bits that are going to go into an utterance. A given utterance, potentially, is going to have what we called last week semantic content. This is what this sentence uttered strictly means. That is, the Phrygian thought that it expresses, or the Russellian proposition or propositional function that it expresses. It's that underlying kind of semantic stuff. And the big thing here is that the semantic content is intimately bound up with truth conditions. Exactly how is hard to articulate. But the idea is that the sentence is going to be true, or the sentence that's uttered is going to be true if and only if the semantic content is in some way accurate or veridical. Maybe there's a correspondence relation between what is expressed or what is meant and the way the world is. Right? These are questions for how we want to understand the notion of truth. But importantly, truth conditions get in here, right? And note that the semantic content of a sentence could be either speaker meaning or sentence meaning. And this was a distinction we made way back when we were thinking about definite descriptions. So the speaker meaning is going to be what was intended, even if it doesn't, strictly speaking, match up with what the words normally mean, versus sentence meaning, which is just what the sentence typically means. So the example here, remember we talked about the man drinking a martini in the corner. If it turns out that he just has a martini glass with water inside, the speaker meaning is still that dude, even though the sentence meaning strictly would be about somebody else entirely. It would fail. And note that because we're allowing it to be speaker meaning, there's going to be a role for intentionality here. And this is where the Gricean stuff we talked about a couple weeks ago comes in. A reflexive intention, right? So, when I utter something and the meaning of my utterance is P, that will be because I want you to believe that P. I want you to recognize that I want you to believe that P, or I intend for you to believe that P. And recognizing my intention is at least part of the cause as to why you believe P. So as well as this semantic content, right, we're also going to have what we might call pragmatic content. And pragmatic content is what else is said, or what else is conveyed. And here the difference is between the strict semantic content of a sentence and the implicatures that are also brought along. Again, you ask me, am I healthy? And I say, I'm living. Strictly, semantically, that just expresses that I am living. Pragmatically, it conveys more. There are implicatures that it carries along to add to the content of the utterance. And this is going to be fixed by speaker intentions and context in the way that the other bit of Grice we talked about does. So I'm going to implicate Q by saying some sentence P, if and only if, well, basically, We presume that I'm obeying the maxims and the cooperative principle. It's common knowledge that I would be using P to get it to Q via, say, violating the maxim, violating one of the principles, flouting a maxim, these kinds of things. Again, the broad structure here is the stuff that we talked about with Grice. So in this case, an utterance is going to have the semantic content, which is tied up with the truth conditions, and the pragmatic content, the implicatures that are also brought along. And then finally, there might be an illocutionary aspect. And who remembers the three words? Austin gave us perlocutionary, illocutionary, and the third one that I have forgotten, right?
Illocutionary?
Something like this. Importantly, the illocutionary one is literally the action that is done by making the utterance, right? The action that's made by speaking. So this is the kind of bit where we actually do something in the act of uttering. It's worth noting that most of the time, if we have sentences that have very clear semantic content, that is, assertions, it's probably not going to have much in the way of illocutionary aspects. Because that was actually one of the key things that Austin wanted to differentiate. He talked about constative versus performative utterances. Constative utterances are ones that make assertions, that make claims about the world, versus the performative ones that don't do that. They just do actions. Okay, so we get a kind of picture that looks like this. And forgive me, I tried to come up with a way to draw this, but I'm not happy with how it came out. This is about the best I could do. So suppose we have a given utterance where some sentence is expressed. We're then going to have two big parts, what's said and what's done. And when we think about what's said, there's going to be what is strictly said, that is the semantic content of the utterance. If you like, this will be the semantic content of the sentence. If we, to go back to what we mentioned earlier, think that sentences themselves carry semantic content. But we don't have to say that. But this will be the strict semantic content, the truth conditions for the sentence. And also the pragmatic content. What else is implicated? What else is conveyed? And all of this content is going to be fixed, at least partially, by the speaker's intentions, the context that's in, and, if there is such a thing, sentence meaning. And note the success here. The utterance is going to be successful. And we can just stipulate this if two conditions are met. First, the truth conditions are satisfied. And second, Grice's reflexive intentions conditions are satisfied. I intend for you to believe the content. I intend for you to recognize my intentions. And I intend that that recognition partially causes you to believe. Again, it's just sort of smashing together all the stuff we've seen. And on the flip side, you have what's done. This is literally just, hey, if you're performing a speech act, this is what happens. There's an interesting question as to whether we want to include the perlocutionary aspects, that is, the effects that are brought about. But broadly, we can leave this aside. And interesting here is that these, the kind of what is done, the success conditions are dependent on felicity. If you remember right, we were talking about when we were doing speech acts, if you're not the referee, calling off sides fails. It's just not a kind of speech act you can commit because you don't have the appropriate authority. It's also dependent on utterance type. If it's an assertion, at least according to Austin, there isn't going to be any illocutionary aspects. It's just the wrong kind of utterance. Okay. Make sense so far?
I have a question about the max. What is precisely meant with the?
Good. So this was when we were talking about Grice, and we talked about the different ways you could do implicatures. So he thinks that there's this broad cooperative principle that governs conversation, and along with this cooperative principle, there's maxims of quality, quantity, relevance. Right? So basically, say what you believe is true or what you feel confident in. Don't say too much. Say stuff that's relevant. These kinds of things. That's the idea.
There's no point the relevant example given the funniest version.
Yes.
Like applying for a position in the Department of Philosophy and you're just only talking about how good their grasp of English is.
Absolutely. They can tie their shoes very, very, very well. This is going to come up. Right? So for the remainder of what we're going to do, I'm going to focus on assertions. Now note, to go back, this is a kind of chart that should work for any type of utterance. Different types of utterances, certain parts are going to be important or less important. I want to focus on utterances. Utterances are sentences that make claims about the world, right? They're constative claims. Now this is useful because what we're interested in will be utterances that have truth conditions. So they express semantic content, and they might also express pragmatic content. They may or may not have elocutionary effects, but that is not interesting for our purposes today. The important thing about assertions is that they're truth apt. We can say that this sentence expressed is true or false. This isn't really the case with other utterance types. For example, an interrogative utterance, a question. It doesn't really make sense to ask if the question's true or false. That's kind of just a misfire. So let's just restrict ourselves for the duration to think about the kinds of utterances that will potentially have truth values. So where the truth conditions are satisfied, the sentence uttered is true. And when the truth conditions are not satisfied, the sentence uttered is false. Note, we can also ask questions about the truth value of implicatures. The pragmatic content of the utterance may also be true or false. And there is a loose sense in which we could use that to evaluate the assertion. But of course, strictly speaking, the assertion's true if the semantic content is true. And it's false if the semantic content's false. But we can broaden the notion out if we want to. Okay. So far, so good? So let's take a really jokey example. We can take the assertion, the door is closed. In this case, the semantic content is going to be, right, the thing denoted by the door satisfies the property of being closed. The uttered sentence is true if and only if that thing is in fact closed. It's communicated because I have the belief that the door is closed. I intend for you to believe that the door is closed, yada, 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 right? All of these are satisfied too. Note that the implicated content might vary wildly depending on context. In this context, it's pretty flat because we're just talking specifically about an example. If you asked me a question about like, hey, what's the exam going to look like? And I said, the door is closed, some really interesting implicatures would start to follow. Again, you see the joke, or I hope you can see the idea. Finally, the illocutionary aspects are extremely muted, maybe not even there at all, because this is a paradigmatic constative utterance. Note, we'll allow that there might be illocutionary aspects, but we can set that aside largely. The things to note, though, is that this is a nice example of an assertion Because assertions are truth apt, and most of the time we make assertions with the aim of veridicality. There's an implicit idea that we make assertions that are true. We try to say stuff that's true, try not to say stuff that's false. And the different kinds of ways of getting it wrong are going to play off that. Different parts of this story are going to fail. So the idea now is to talk about different ways that we could fail in making an assertion. That's what I mean by getting it wrong. So the first way I want to talk about getting it wrong is nonsense. And this is, honest to God, my favorite quote in the world. I love this. I don't think it'd be like it is, but it do. Oscar is a genius. So, nonsense. Note what was implicit about what we talked about just a second ago. To go back. Implicit in this whole picture is that what's uttered is a sentence in the first place. That is, that the thing uttered satisfies the relevant rules of grammar for the language that we're using. But of course, that's not always the case, right? But note, it does highlight something. If our utterance is going to have semantic content, if our assertion has semantic content, then it needs to satisfy the grammatical rules. In order to be truth apt, you need to be some kind of truth apt vehicle. Is not enough for truth aptness. It's not a sentence yet. Not strictly. Note that saying to have semantic content you need to satisfy the sentence construction rules doesn't mean that content cannot be conveyed. We'll come back again to the sound I just made in a second. That conveys content, but it does not have semantic content. It does not, strictly speaking, have truth conditions. So my going, isn't true or false, though it might communicate, convey, implicate propositions that are true or false. So, okay. In order to have semantic content, you've got to be a sentence. You've got to be in the grammar rules, right? Satisfy the grammar rules. Nonsense fails. The first way of getting something wrong is nonsense. Nonsense is easiest to demonstrate via example. There's a famous bit of nonsense, right? The opening lines from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, right? 'Twas brillig and the slithy toads did gyre and gimble in the wabe. And this is so tricky because it's so close to English, but it's not, right? And it feels like gyre and gimble must obviously be verbs. They are not. And brillig and slithy toads, these are nonsense, right? There is no such words here. So this sentence fails because it's got content. In this case, what I mean is subsentential parts that are meaningless. So there is no, if you like, Phrygian thought expressed. There's no Russellian proposition expressed. There is no semantic content here. Now note, we might say sentence S, or better, because it's not strictly a sentence, string S is nonsense in a language if and only if it expresses no content. But this might be too strong, because you might have, again, expressions that lack semantic content but still convey something. Take my again, right? No semantic content, it's not truth apt, but it conveys content. It says something. It's not nonsense in the same way that this is. Which, strictly speaking, don't say nothing.
Is this considered to be a definition of nonsense, or?
Yeah, so these are kind of ways to start to get a grip on a definition, right? So we might think of this as like a very bad first step. A better one is going to be something like this, right? So we can say string S is nonsense if and only if it fails to express semantic content.
But to what extent is the semantic content dependent on the pragmatic content of the sentence?
Yeah, good. So that's a heavy question. And this is where we have to come back to the discussion about Grice and about the kind of formal conception of language. If we think that what gets language started is intentions of speakers, there's almost a sense in which the intentionality comes in first to fix semantic and pragmatic bits. There's never going to be a case where pure pragmatic content comes first, though. Because you need to at least say something to then be able to start to play off of it. Put another way, in order to understand how you're flouting or violating the maxims, you need to know what it's like to obey them.
Why can't the pragmatic content come first? So your answer to how is it going, that seems to be even prior to semantic content, right?
There's a sense, right? There's a sense. And this is where maybe it's kind of, it comes back to the questions we were talking about last week with expressibility. Right? If we think that noise expresses something, we need to either be able to articulate it or we can't articulate it. If we can articulate it, there's a sense in which the semantic content, the actual explication, was there. In order, right? In other words, we could have said it. I just didn't. And if I couldn't say it, is it really there? It's that kind of expressibility point again. But again, these sort of pseudo definitions are very problematic. I don't think they're probably perfectly accurate. But they get us towards an idea. And we can start to see how this nonsense thing would look if we go back again to this kind of mapping, right? So I've just got the Lewis Carroll quote at the top, and note the points of failure here, right? So there is no semantic content. There is no what is said. So there's no way to really, strictly speaking, talk about the claim being true or false. There's no truth conditions here. Similarly, it's not believed to be true because there's no content to be believed. This is also going to fail. The reflexive Gracian intentions can't go through because there's nothing to believe, so there's nothing to get you to believe. But note that this doesn't mean it can't convey something. Right? I might use this nonsense, which doesn't, strictly speaking, say anything, to convey something, right? E.g. by, say, violating the maxim of relevance. Why am I adding this weird, this nonsense string as a reply? Because he's trying to avoid answering the question. He's trying to suggest that that was a bad question. He's trying to, again, fill in whatever's going on in the case, in the context. And we can assess this pragmatic content for truth values, right? This pragmatic content itself might be true or false, but it's strange to take that as then telling us whether the utterance is true or false. It's not really sensible to say that. Right? And of course, this also could be a speech act. There's an interesting thing, though. If this is a speech act, it's not clear to me that it's nonsense anymore. because then it's just moved what kind of utterance it is. It's only going to count as nonsense if we think that this is meant to be a failed assertion. But if we treat it as a speech act, then it was never an assertion in the first place. It was something else entirely. And then it's not nonsense.
So how do you define then nonsense?
Good. So I mean, this is
Not something which is wrong, but something which simply doesn't convey meaning.
yeah. I mean, that's kind of the idea, right? It fails the grammatical rules, so it fails to be an adequate conveyance of meaning. So it doesn't convey meaning because of grammatical failures. That would be one thought. Right? But even that's not going to work because if we remember the example from last week, the colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Satisfies grammatical rules, but fails to convey meaning. So there's some kind of articulation of nonsense that needs to be made.
Yeah, whereas on the other hand, your answer fails the grammatical rules, but it does convey meaning.
It does convey.
That's the other way around.
Yeah. That's the interesting thing here, right? So that's really what I'm trying to gesture at, right? This nonsense case is one where, because of this failure in at the grammatical level, it cannot be read as expressing semantic content, cannot be taken to be true or false, but it could still convey something pragmatically. But if that's how we understand it, then my turns out to be nonsense, which is not the right reading. There's something deeply different between this kind of thing and this. And exactly how to articulate that is hard, and I don't know the right answer here. But we have a kind of grip, I feel like, an intuitive grip on what we mean when we're talking about nonsense. It is this failure at the grammatical level, and it fails at the grammatical level, and fails then to convey semantic meaning. Does not have truth value, because it is not truth apt. Since there is no content it can't believe to be true, it can't satisfy the reflexive intentions. Okay. Now that's the first of the 5 that I wanted to get to. And the broad idea, I hope, is conveyed, and I'm very happy to admit the sketch of a definition that I have given is not going to be adequate. I don't know what a good definition is going to look like. Something interesting to think about. Now, the next pair that we're going to talk about, we'll call error and lying. And maybe before we dive in, we can quickly just take a step back and ask, did you guys, so I presume in some ethics classes and things, you guys have talked about lying? I mean, you've got to have done it with Kant. Please, God, tell me.
Oh, yeah, lying with Kant.
About the murderer at the door kind of thing, right? In those cases, I suspect that the whole discussion was about whether it's moral to lie or not to lie. Did you ever talk about what a lie actually is?
Well, it's intentionally not telling the truth, but I don't think we really had a specific.
Not even that, right? Because if it's intentionally not telling the truth, that's a lie. We see the problem, right? Because it can't just be intentionally not telling the truth. Then nonsense counts as lying. That's not right. That cannot be correct, right? If I tell you this, I'm not lying. I'm speaking nonsense. You see the trick? But that's a good place to start, because that intentionally not telling the truth is a very intuitive kind of thing.
But you could also interpret it as intentionally not telling the truth. Or how do you put it? Intentionally telling something that is false.
Nice.
Because otherwise, then you do have meaning, but it's...
Nice. So this will help us get rid of nonsense.
Okay.
But this is gonna lead into another kind of
Okay.
fun cases, right?
Without doubt.
Yeah. This is where we're gonna go next. So, importantly, we're at 1:30. Is everybody okay if we take a 10-minute break and then come back and we'll pick up with lying in error? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, we'll come back at 1:40 and we'll go from there.